Welcome to the Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. Truth and reconciliation carries a painfully indelible meaning in Canada, least of which for Indigenous peoples who endured unspeakable treatment in residential schools at the hands of the state and church. From 2008 to 2015, a national commission documented the traumatic stories of Indigenous survivors of this abusive system that lasted more than 160 years in what is now acknowledged as a cultural genocide. Aanishinaabe of the Ojibwe Nation, James Darin Corbiere, is a multidisciplinary artist and creator of the educational board game The Truth in Truth and Reconciliation. Today we delve into Canada's dark past and talk about the objective behind his groundbreaking game. We will also learn about James's journey from law enforcement to teaching to artistry. It's a pleasure to welcome to the show Indigenous educator, comic book writer, and illustrator, James Darin Corbiere. Hello, James.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, Fabio. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
I'm happy to be here. I'm doing well. I'm out here on the West Coast, and it's a beautiful sunny morning.
Just a cautionary note to listeners, this discussion centers on the suffering inflicted on Indigenous peoples through colonization and the residential school system in Canada, and it covers themes of church abuse, police brutality, intergenerational trauma, and PTSD. Bear in mind that while James is sharing his personal story and ideas through an Indigenous lens, his insights may not necessarily encompass the range of Indigenous perspectives on this multifaceted topic. Before we dive into your board game, I wonder if you can define for us from an Indigenous perspective, what is truth and reconciliation?
That's a tough question to answer. There's a lot of interpretations that are out and about. From my perspective, and this is just one perspective, the truth is about talking about the past in an honest and open way, acknowledging the nasty things that have gone on. There was an elder in our community. His name is Eddie Benton Benai Ba. I use Ba because he's in the next life now. And one of the things that he had stated was that in order to heal, you have to know the wound. And so I guess it's from that perspective that I went back and I looked at Canadian history to understand why the conditions are the way they are today for Indigenous people. So this is the wound. And in order for us to heal from it, we have to go back in history and see where it began, where those things began. So for me, that was the part of the truth, going back and finding all of these things that had gone on. And then instead of having the sugar-coated version of history that Canadians are often fed, you have an accurate recounting of those events. In terms of reconciliation is huge. And really, I don't think anyone has a definite definition about what reconciliation looks like. We sort of understand the concept. We have an idea, perhaps, about what reconciliation means, but we don't know how to go about it or who has to do it. From my perspective, I'm in the process right now of designing the reconciliation game. So in the truth game, the truth is volume one, right? The truth and reconciliation. So volume two of this game series is going to be the reconciliation game, and then there we're going to look at definitions around reconciliation. And so far in my musings, and this is just completely my own musings, but reconciliation, first of all, is in terms of truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation is not for Indigenous people to have to do. It's like the victim coming up and apologizing for getting beat up or assaulted, right? And there's no that shouldn't happen that way. It's usually the abuser or the one who's committed the crime who has to come up, and they're the ones who have to reconcile what they've done and sort of work things out with the people that they've hurt. So as far as I'm concerned, Indigenous people have nothing to reconcile for in that regard, in this national concept of truth and reconciliation. However, having said that, in years of living differently than in our own ways, adopting or carrying on behaviors that aren't necessarily our own to begin with, we have done a lot of damage within our own communities, and so there are things that we must reconcile on different levels. So, for example, I have to reconcile with myself. I have to, accept who I am. I have to be honest about my own shortcomings, my own, if I've done things that have hurt other people, I have to reconcile within myself. So that's one level, reconcile with self, reconcile within families. So within our own families, we have people who have caused harm, and that needs to be reconciled. That needs to be mended. Those wounds need to be healed. Then there's society. So we're going up three different levels: society, family, community, I guess, or society, community, and society. They're kind of like in the same category. When I talk about society, I'm talking about a lot of the behaviors and activities. I'm still trying to find other examples of societal ways in which reconciliation can be made. The promotion of falsehoods, misleading information, especially in an age, with social media and all the false information that's out there and the propaganda that's out there. We really got to watch for things like that and be mindful that a lot of this stuff that they're putting out there is not the truth. So we have to reconcile with that information. And then there's the church and the crown. There's a level of reconciliation that needs to be done there, where the church and the crown need to reconcile with Indigenous people. And finally, again, in my opinion, reconciliation also has to occur with the elements, the earth. And so in this new game, the reconciliation game, you're going to have like these 5 categories of cards: self, family, community, society, and the earth, as part of those things that all need to work within that concept of reconciliation and what we can do to make things better.
Thank you so much for explaining that from your vantage point, and to also delve into the concept of not only what truth means for you, but the various categories of reconciliation, and also the idea of creating this new board game that you're designing at the moment. So, why don't we talk about the game itself? So, I mentioned in the introduction that you are an educator and specifically around Indigenous studies. So, what inspired you to conceive of and design this board game?
Well, as you mentioned, I was a police officer for many years in the city of Sudbury, and then in my hometown of Wiki. And I got hurt at work, retrained as a teacher. My first teaching gig was a grade 5 classroom, and then after that, I went to teaching at a high school level. I taught my language, Aanishinaabe. When we ran out of students, or when there weren't enough students to fill a language class, they would give me Canadian history to teach. And I would teach to the curriculum. And in addition to whatever was in the textbook, I also added more information, but coming from an Indigenous perspective. Like July 1st, 1867 is probably the best example, or the easiest example, how everybody celebrates Canada Day, right? July 1st, 1867, hooray! Well, it may be great for Canada and the settlers, but in terms of Indigenous communities, well, we lost our land, right? And so that's the Indigenous perspective on the same day. One is celebrating creation, the other one is celebrating, destruction, I guess, in a sense, because we've lost all our land as a result. Anyway, it was the May long weekend in 2017. I put together this. Initially, it was a cheat sheet to help my students study for exams in Canadian history. And I thought that was going to be kind of boring. So then I turned them into flashcards. And then I thought that would be pretty boring too. So I turned the flashcards into this game. And in this game, we had to circle this place called Turtle Island. And as we were circling around Turtle Island, we would land on these color coded spaces and then draw the corresponding color coded card. And on the back of that card, it would have a fact, an historical fact about Canada. And then I thought, okay, well, let's wager something. What's it worth? What do we have to do here? We have to. And I thought, okay, well, we have to survive colonization. And so I came up with currency in the game. The original game was land, language, culture, and identity. It's still in the game. And what the Indigenous player had to do, or Indigenous person had to do, was make sure that they survived the colonization process. And the initial game in my classroom was that you had to go around Turtle Island 4 times in order to survive the colonization process. And if you had any of your land, language, culture, and identity still intact by the time you went around the circle 4 times, then you were considered a survivor. So that was basically the premise of the game. The kids loved it. I was surprised at the response. The kids enjoyed the game. They thought it was a great way to study Canadian history rather than just reading, the chapter in the textbook and then answering the 2 or 3 comprehension questions at the end of the chapter. So from there, it wasn't until so this was in May when I first introduced the prototype game to my students, and then it wasn't until October, probably around Thanksgiving in October 2017, I brought the game with me. I don't know why I brought it. I just brought it for fun. I didn't think it was really going to go anywhere. Earlier in the introduction, you had mentioned the comic book illustrator. That's my goal. That's my baby. That's my dream. The game is it was a sidetrack, but the ultimate goal is finishing writing these comic books. I had 2 of them finished by then, and I saw Nelson Publishing. They're a big educational resource publisher in Canada. They were also set up at the same conference. So I went to them and I said, "Hey, you want to come down, take a look? I've got my comic books. Maybe that might be something you'd be interested in." They came down, and I had the comic books out, and then next to the comic books was the prototype of the board game. And they looked at the comic books and they said, "Okay, well, maybe even." I said, "Well, tell me about this." And so I explained the game to them just the way I explained it to you, about the goal and the concept about having to circle Turtle Island and things like that. And then you pick up these truth and consequence cards along the way and you read them out and you suffer the consequences. Anyway, they liked the idea, and they wanted to meet again in January of 2018. So let's say by October, I was just probably about a year or 2 into doing my artwork, my style of artwork. I thought, okay, well, you know what? If Nelson is really interested in this prototype, then maybe what I'll do is I'll add artwork and a few more details. And I hired a graphic designer. Gabrielle Fogg was her name at the time, and she took my artwork and elements from my comic books and incorporated them into the game, and into the game that you see now. So all of the artwork is based on, or a derivative of, my original artwork. And Nelson, they loved it when we met again in January 2018. I presented them with a finished copy or just about finished copy of the game with all the artwork and the graphics in place, and they just absolutely loved the idea. From there, we negotiated some changes. We worked on some changes, gameplay, added a couple of extra things like eagle feather counting cards to count how many times you've gone around Turtle Island, or to keep track of how many times you've gone around Turtle Island. And then they pitched the game in Ontario, where I think it was the Catholic boards asked that I remove the shame cards in the game. In addition to the land, language, culture, and identity cards, the church and the crown, right from the beginning, right from the prototype, the church and the crown either gave out status cards or earned shame cards. And the Catholic school boards in Ontario wanted the shame cards removed from the game. I responded by creating humility cards and saying, no, I'm not going to remove the shame cards. The shame cards are going to stay in the game. And when they came back and they said they liked the humility cards, but they still want the shame cards removed, and I said no. So Nelson walked away from pursuing the game. And then it took a while. It took about 7 more years before I found Medicine Wheel Publishing, and they picked up the game and published it. And now we're sold out. we released the games in September 2024, and we sold out by March this year, 2026. So in 18 months, sold 3,000 games, 3,000 copies. So it's gone over really well, like surprisingly well.
Congratulations. That is
Yeah,
so amazing. That is such a
thank you.
great milestone. I'm
Yes,
really glad for the success of it. Now, you have two versions of the game. You have one for grade schoolers from 7 to 13 years old, and you have another version for 14 plus. So, what's the distinction between those two formats?
the original game is the kind of like the adult game, the 14 and older grade. I was teaching grade 10 when I created the game, first created the game. In it, it's a role playing game. It's now a role playing game. You have land, language, culture, and identity. Each player is an individual player in the original game, and your goal is to collect 4 eagle feathers before you run out of land, language, culture, and identity. There are shame cards and status cards, as well as your land, language, culture, and identity cards in the original game. So from there, the elementary game has essentially the same information as the original game in terms of the card stock. It's just age appropriate. So the elementary game covers from grades, well, it starts with grade 3, 4, and then 5, 6, and then 7, 8. The board is simplified. The shame and status cards have been removed, and here is where we bring back the humility cards. So the humility cards are in the elementary game, and in the elementary game, it's more of a cooperative game in the sense that all of the players hold in common all of the land, language, culture, and identity. So it's our loss as opposed to my loss, right? Whenever in the original game land is surrendered, it would be me personally who would lose my land, as opposed to in the elementary game where we would lose our land. So it's more of a cooperative community kind of setting. There's a map now in the elementary game that shows Canada, like a pre-colonial map of Canada, and then it's split into 4 pieces, so four quadrants, 4 little squares, and they're color coded according to the colors of the 4 currencies that we have. So there's land, language, culture, and identity. Land is green, language is blue, culture is yellow, identity is red. So we have those color coded pieces of the map. So whenever you lose a certain component, let's say you lose all of your land, then you're going to take the green piece of the puzzle and you're going to flip it over, and then it changes into whatever part of Canada. And then as you lose all of your currency, then these pieces flip over and they change colors until you have a current map of Canada. which is just basically on a grayscale. And on the current map of Canada, which is on the backside, you have the churches. So they have a whole bunch of little red crosses, like a legend. You have a bunch of little red crosses dotted all across Canada, where you see the residential schools and where they were approximately. And then there are crowns, so little golden crowns or yellow crowns, and the crowns represent the provincial or territorial capitals. So it's another, I don't know, kinesthetic way of learning, of seeing the change over time, I guess, because as you're losing your values, like land, language, culture, and identity, you can see the map flipping over from this beautiful, bright, colorful depiction to the grayscale. And it's pretty powerful. I think it's pretty powerful anyway. It worked out really well. So that's the main differences. The adult one is an individual effort versus a community or cooperative game for the elementary version. Instead of each individual earning 4 eagle feathers in order to survive, we survive as a community. So each of us, whenever we earn an eagle feather, we contribute it to the whole. And once all of us have earned 4 eagle feathers, then we've won the game, or we're considered survivors.
I'm just curious. I want to circle back on something that you said. You
Yeah.
said that initially, when you were pursuing getting your board game published, and the Catholic school board said, no, we don't want this because we don't want to see the shame cards. I'm curious about whether they are now customers of yours.
One of the interesting things that I have been told, and through the publisher, is that Catholic schools all across Canada have purchased the game and they use the game. One of the interesting little bits of feedback that I received was that in one of these Catholic schools, whenever the church got a shame card, the students would cheer. And that was really interesting to hear about. Or yeah, I can imagine that reaction, right? Where the church earns a shame card, and the students stand around, and celebrate. As part of my fundraising efforts to get the game published throughout the years, I think it was in 2022, the Catholic Church was supposed to contribute $30 million to the Truth and Reconciliation Fund, that $2 billion compensation package. The church was supposed to contribute $30 million to this fund. They didn't. They were absolved of having to do that back in 2017. There was a court in Saskatchewan who forgave the church of that debt. But the church had promised that they would raise the money and they would administer a $30 million, I think it was called an Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. And so they opened up these grant applications across Canada where, if you had an activity that was intended to the purposes of reconciliation, that you can apply to the Catholic Church and they would grant up to $50,000 towards your project. I was residing here in BC on Vancouver Island at the time when I applied, and the archdiocese around here, I think, is in Vancouver. So anyway, my application went to Vancouver, and when I talked to them on the phone, like I called them up and I asked about it, and I said, "Hey, I've got this game," and then they said, "Wow, that's a great idea. That sounds like such an innovative way of." When I sent in my application, things changed. I don't know what happened, but their excitement really went downhill. They were turned off, I think, when they saw the shame cards, perhaps, I don't know. But they asked, where are you originally from? Well, I'm originally from Manitoulin Island in Ontario. And they said, well, we're looking for to provide support for local Indigenous efforts, and so you're going to have to apply to your archdiocese, and they referred me to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So I applied to Sault Ste. Marie. I sent them the same information. I applied to the Sault Ste. Marie Archdiocese, and they turned around and said, well, you're not living in the area, so you don't qualify, right? So either I'm not from the area or I'm not living in the area. But either way, it was a reason for them to disqualify me from accessing that so-called Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. Otherwise, I might have had the game published earlier. Not that that matters. There was it worked out. It worked out anyway. But it's just I don't know some of the strange things that come up and some of the responses that I've had from this organization. I don't know. That's one of the big parts of reconciliation that has to happen, and that'll probably be one of the primary focus of the reconciliation game would be on what the church can do to make things better.
It's such an innovative way to have a difficult conversation because I don't know that the average Canadian, including myself, knows how to have a conversation around truth and reconciliation. And to be able to create a game and to do it from an Indigenous lens and to honor all of the survivors in the process and to really help transform the pain experienced collectively, especially for Indigenous peoples, through this game is really powerful. I haven't played the game, but just hearing you describe it and the thinking and the intention behind the game and what the objectives are, I find it to be really powerful.
It can be. I think for a lot of people, in my experience anyway, having the game set up at different venues, different events, a lot of people will walk by and they'll pick up the cards and they'll read the information on the cards and they'll jump or have that jolt as if they've been shocked, and then they'll put the card down and kind of wander off, or they'll come back and they'll say, geez, I've heard of this stuff. I grew up in a community near an Indigenous community, and we all have heard stories and rumors about the residential schools, but no, that's all we thought they were they were just rumors, and or in other cases, in addition to validating the rumors that the settlers might have grown up hearing, there are others who haven't had that experience or have that knowledge of the residential schools who may have experienced this for the first time. And they sort of question things because they're in a position where they've been fed some misinformation perhaps about the residential school system, like it never happened, or there are deniers out there who can't accept the truth, so they go around denying it. But there are a lot of people who come back and as they hear more and more, find out more about true Canadian history, then they tend to come around and accept that it is a good way to have these conversations. The When we play the game, when I designed it, it was intended to take about an hour. So in a typical high school period or class, it's 75 minutes long. So you get in for the first 5 minutes, you get all your students settled down and take attendance and do all that sort of thing. And then there's a few minutes where you would talk about, here we're gonna play this game today, and it's about, and you give a little brief introduction, and then you get the game set up, or maybe you have the game set up already, but you get the game set up and then split your students up into teams or individuals, and then you start playing the game. You might get through 2 rounds with 12 players. It took roughly about an hour for us, and we'd only maybe go through 1, 2 rounds where everybody got to roll the dice and move their player cards, mostly because it was a lot of conversation, right? Rolling the dice and moving your person takes 30 seconds maybe. The next minute and a half, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever the case may be, was spent on having these discussions. So you'd read the card and then, wow, I didn't know that, or some other student might say, yeah, I remember my grandmother telling me about that, or like I was in a school where there was a lot of Indigenous kids teaching in the Sioux, so they would come up, they would pipe up about their own little personal experiences. And again, it's just a feedback. Just people would say, "Wow, like wow, I heard about that, or I didn't really think that that would happen. Really, that happened in Canada? Like, holy smokes, we thought Canada was better, or things like that would come up in those conversations, and that's where most of the time was spent. So maybe 15 minutes of that hour long period would be spent on just rolling and moving and reading the consequence cards, the cards. The other 45 minutes would be spent on discussions, right? So we would have those talks about the different truths that are talked about in the truth and consequence cards.
You write on your website, art came back into my life after I gave the church its demons back. As a child, I used to see light around people until Christianity stripped that away. 50 years later, I let that pain go. Color returned to my world, this time in the form of healing, vibrant artwork. Only share what you feel comfortable sharing, but I am curious to learn more about your relationship with the church and how you were able to reclaim your spirit.
Well, my grandmother and some of my aunties and uncles went to residential schools. I was raised in the Catholic tradition as much as possible, in the Catholic tradition as much as we understood it. When I was a child, I used to be able to, I would look at people and I would see colors around them, and they would define them now today as auras. But it wasn't just like white light, like we would normally associate an aura as being, like this steady brightness. If it was actual colors, I describe it as when you turn on the gas stove, the little flames that come up. Yeah, so little orange and blue and colored little licks of flame that would be all around you, and you would be in silhouette, and this would be like your background, all these colors. There was an abusive at the time anybody from the church was a priest to me. It turns out he wasn't a priest, but anyway, to me he was one of these abusive priests, and I was one of his many victims. There were 111 of us children that this man had abused, and shortly after that the abuse began up at the church. Then I stopped seeing those lights that went away. So when I turned 50, struggling with I was a police officer for a number of years, and there's some PTSD related circumstances there, but it was PTSD primarily related to the abuse that I experienced as a child, and it came to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't carry it anymore, and so I decided to do something about it. And that's why I say, instead of carrying those demons around with me, I took them back to the church where they came from. Oh, that was 11 years ago. Switching from different ways of coping, from addiction, going through periods of addiction, to lots of counseling and therapy. Shortly after I decided that I was going to do something about the abuse, to resolve it, or to deal with it, I went on a fast, like a vision quest. So one of the things that Anishinaabe youth, historically, Anishinaabe youth, probably pre-contact, maybe even sometime after, but one of the things that our young men did when they were in their around the age of puberty, they would be put out in on the land for 4 days to go fast, to go on a vision quest, what was called a vision quest. The belief is that men are born without purpose, and when they mature from boys to men, it's during that time that we have to go out and we have to seek our purpose, and you do that through a vision quest. So I hadn't done that, with settler, with the church, thinking and things like that. That was, the work of the devil, all that other stuff. So it wasn't something that we had practiced. And so when I was 50, I decided that I was going to go out on a fast. I went out on a fast. I was only out for 3 days, but it was during that time that something opened up, something happened. When I got out of the fast, about a month later, I went out and I bought all this wood. One of my dreams growing up on the res, I was living probably about 50 meters from the water, and I'd be down in the water every day, like even from this time of year, like as soon as the ice was gone. off the lake. I'd be down and I'd be down on the water, in the water, and living on the water. I would see elders come in with their boats, big wooden fishing boats and things like that. There was one elder who went out daily. He was like a commercial fisherman, had a big wooden boat. So I wanted to build a big wooden boat, and my fast was done in May 2015, and in June 2015 I bought all this wood. I was going to use that to build a boat. That was my intention. It didn't work out that way, so it was probably February or March of 2015 when I made that conscious decision to do something about my history, I guess. And I was experiencing a lot of flashbacks, a lot of PTSD. I was numbing the pain with heavy use of marijuana. All of this happened in 2015. So in November 2015, I came home and I was just absolutely losing it. And I had some of this wood that I had picked up in June in the basement of the place where I was living at the time. And I'm one of those guys. I used to carry the pens around in my pocket, and I was breaking things. I tore off my shirt and I was smashing things and hitting things. And one of the things I did was I busted a pen on a chunk of wood that I had set up. I was going to turn it into a boat, right? So I had this pen on this chunk of wood, and it smashed or it broke or I broke it, and it leaked ink onto the wood. And then from there, I started adding, you know, I just kept going. I had some highlighters being a teacher, you know, had some other things like that around, and I just started adding more color. And then within probably about maybe 3 hours, I had a little piece of artwork. I didn't think of it as artwork then. I thought it was just more like doodling, but that's what first started the artwork. And then I guess the healing, I guess, from there, because since then, over the years, now it's been 11 years since I started doing art, and I produced probably about 300 pieces of artwork, including the game. So now the color has returned. I don't know if you can see in behind me over my shoulder here. My artwork is very bright, vivid, colorful, and I think that's where those colors that I used to see as a kid, I can't see them now. I still can't, but they're expressed in the artwork that I've created over the last 10 years or so. So they have returned, but in a different form. Now everybody can see it, I guess, as opposed to me. I thought that was normal. I thought that was something that people could do. I thought that was normal to be able to see things like that, but I guess that's a unique gift to be able to have been able to do that.
You're offering your gift of light and color for the world. And that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing your story. I really do appreciate it. And I think that it's important for people to hear because I think that when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we might hear about it from a very broad perspective, and it can sometimes sound a little bit impersonal when we are unable to connect it to the experience of someone who went through that journey. And so for you to open up and talk about your personal experience, I think is powerful, not only for me, but for every single listener that is hearing your story. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you for creating that space.
Let's go back in time a little bit. You
Okay.
were talking about how you are originally from Manitoulin Island, beautiful part of Ontario, absolutely beautiful, right across from the Bruce Peninsula.
Hmm.
And there's a point at which you decide, and you talked about it a little bit earlier, you make a decision that you want to go into the police force and you start your career in Sudbury. So, what was the inspiration behind that?
Simply put, I got tired of seeing my uncles getting beat up all the time by the police. That was a typical interaction with the OPP. The OPP were the ones who were policing in the reserve and Wiki. We did have a few of our own local band members who were police officers. I tend to think that they were policing a little differently, but it was often the OPP. When the OPP came in, there were fights always, all the time. And growing up as a child, you didn't understand the effects of intergenerational trauma or the effects of trauma, because some of the people, my uncles went to residential schools and they were also abused. And so the only method by which they had to cope would be through alcohol misuse. And they were angry. I was angry too. I was also motivated for self-protection. Cops were in my mind anyway, they were the most well-protected group of people on the res. And because of that, not even the priests would mess with me anymore, right? Because I was a cop, and you're not going to mess with the cops. So that was part of the motivation. I'm Bear Clan, and in the old traditional Anishinaabe societies, the Bear Clan was responsible for the safety and protection of the people, whether that was through peacekeeping as opposed to soldiering, peacekeeping, and through healing. So a lot of the members of the Bear Clan, it would have been our responsibility to act as either doctors, nurses, or police officers. And so I also wanted to follow within that tradition, being from the Bear Clan, coming from the Bear Clan. So those were kind of like the three motivating factors: wanting to, my own personal safety, wanting to look after my community members and treat them differently compared with how the OPP treated us or treated them, and I wanted to continue I guess a tradition from part of the Bear Clan as being part of the Bear Clan.
It is kind of ironic in the sense that the police enacted brutal punishment to Indigenous people, family members of yours, and at the same time you found it as a source of protection for yourself. And when we look at the stats, and this comes from Statistics Canada and Public Safety Canada, that the numbers of Indigenous people in federal prison has climbed since the 80s. So in the 80s, it was between 10 and 15% roughly. And now it's 30% of the prison population. And what I found also alarming is that 50% of that number is comprised of Indigenous women. When you hear this, I'm curious from your perspective as an Indigenous person, but also someone who worked in the police force. How do you process that information?
About the high rate of incarceration.
About the high rate of incarceration, but also the fact that you were a part of a system that has caused that as well.
I guess I should remind you that my philosophy was not one of enforcement. I mentioned previously about peacekeepers, and that was the role and the responsibility of the Bear Clan within the old societies, the old communities. I always approached my philosophy for policing wasn't enforcement. It wasn't about an us versus them kind of mentality. It was about looking after the people, taking care of the people, and making sure that they were, they had what they needed, and I would do my very best to avoid having to arrest them or lock them up or incarcerate them. I mean, in severe circumstances, severe assault or sexual assault or something of the nature, there was no question that they should be locked up, right? Because that's not unacceptable in any circumstance. It doesn't matter what society you're from. You do silly things like that, then yeah, you're going to get locked up. I'm going to lock you up. But if it's If it's a minor issue that can be better resolved through negotiation, then I would prefer to take the time to sit there and negotiate and try to resolve it. Arresting someone or charging someone with a criminal offense was always the last option, the final option. So instead of automatically going to arrest first and then sort it out later, I was more like, let's try to work this out before we get to that point. And I tend to think that's more of an Indigenous way of dealing with those circumstances. In my research for the game, the further west you move from about Thunder Bay onward, westward, you'll see that those incarceration rates, I think, really increase dramatically in Western Canada versus Eastern Canada. The last time I was in Ontario, I was shopping in Sudbury at the mall in New Sudbury. Everything was fine. I came shopping out here in Western Canada, and I was followed around in the grocery store. I had people, following me throughout the store. I just moved out here, and I can't remember. I think my partner and I at the time we were looking for linen, I think it was pillowcases. So I was standing near the pillows in this in this department store, and then I heard I'm an old police officer, right? And I heard the code, the security code 33, and then I noticed that there were about four people, four store employees, all in the same section, all fluffing the pillows and doing all these little things, and it's almost like I had this little entourage following me around the store. So I tend to think that when you look at the distribution of residential schools across Canada and the path taken by the early RCMP when they were sent to quell the uprisings in Western Canada in the late 1870s, there's a pattern there. The two of them are almost all line over line. Like you can see where all the forts are set up. That's where all the RCMP went, and that's where all of the residential schools are set up around. So there's definitely a pattern, and the incidence, I think, of incarceration is probably much higher out here in the West than it is back east. I'm not sure about those numbers anymore, but years ago when I was creating the game, that's what I had noticed. Part of the reconciliation game is I'm going to focus a lot of the information on what the RCMP can do to reconcile, because they're a big part of the causing the problem in the first place with Indigenous people because of their attitudes, that us versus them kind of mentality, rather than living up to those concepts of serve and protect. Right? Well, who are they serving and protecting? Is certainly not Indigenous people. So I can't speak for the courts. The courts do what they do. There is systemic racism built right into the system. There probably do have to be some legislative changes, some policy changes that need to take place. I don't know all of that. That's a huge task, but that would be certainly one of those areas that could change for the better to help better serve Indigenous needs. We also have in Indigenous communities, we also have the downriver effects of the residential school system. So if your parents went to the residential school or your grandparents went to the residential school, they grew up missing out on a lot of basic skills that they would need in order for them to cope within the community. They'd come back, they'd be broken, and looking for ways to either cope with the brokenness or fill that emptiness. And they would use the maladaptive ways of coping. And of course, their children would see these maladaptive ways of coping and think that was normal. And so they would copy, right? We learn from our parents. We do things, whether we realize it or not, we do things that we learn from our parents. We copy things that subconsciously, or maybe it's genetically encoded, but we do things that our parents do, whether we like it or not. In some cases, whether we like it or not, but there are things that are passed down from generation to generation that are like I said, maladaptive, inappropriate, but it's almost become the norm, it seems, in some ways, because maybe you've grown up, you're a grandchild, and you've grown up, you've seen your parents drinking or abusing or being abused or, assaultive or violent, because they've seen their grandparent, their parents drinking and assaulting and being violent, because that's how they are coping with the abuse and the violence that was inflicted upon them while they were kids at the residential schools, right? So this is the stuff that's being passed down from one generation to the next. And again, my humble opinion, I'm not an expert in any sense of the word, but when you have alcohol involved in our women when they're pregnant, there's a high rate of the FASD, the fetal alcohol syndrome. That is a brain disorder, a brain development issue. And so when your brain is not fully formed, obviously you're not going to be able to be fully cognizant of all your actions and your thoughts and feelings. And you'll see a lot of that. Then there's, because of the violence, there's a lot of brain injury. Like, as a police officer, I used to see, accidents and things like that where people got hurt. You get a broken arm, you put a cast on it. That's obvious, right? And okay, well, take it easy. You have a broken arm. Don't do whatever, because it's going to aggravate things. But if you get hit in the head, it's not like you can put a cast on your head, right? And you've got this very sensitive object, this brain in there that also gets injured and can suffer permanent damage. And I tend to think that impacts behavior. You may have heard of, I don't know, maybe some people have personally experienced differences in personality traits or behavior from friends or family who have been involved in accidents where they've received some severe head trauma. Whether they talk slower or forget things, or and those are some of the minor issues. Some of them have total changes in their behavior where they get really angry all of a sudden. So that seems to be prevalent in Indigenous communities, because we're constantly fighting with each other, and again, because of the violence that we've learned, right? And that's another one of those things that has to be taken back, one of those demons that has to be dropped off. I don't know for sure, but I like to think that in the old days that sort of violence wasn't common in our communities. And that probably didn't happen. A lot of that probably didn't happen until after the residential schools were introduced. So, yeah, there are a lot of other factors involved. I wish I could do more. I wish I could do more to change that, but that's a huge task. That's a massive task.
You are doing a lot just through your art, through this game, the Truth and Reconciliation, through your upcoming reconciliation game. Thank you for going through all of the layers, because there's so many factors that you've highlighted that can contribute to the incarceration rates that we're seeing with Indigenous people. And you've highlighted them from the trauma of the past to the police brutality and racial profiling of the present, and how that cascades over the generations as well. I want to highlight a couple things just for our listeners who may not know some of the acronyms used. So RCMP refers to Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So they are a national police force. And then OPP is Ontario Provincial Police. So that would be akin to a state police force. So I just wanted to clarify that. I also wanted to ask you, because as you were talking, something came to my mind about your reconciliation game. Is there a healing piece to that game?
In what form?
I don't know, but I kind of felt that in the process of reconciliation through all of the categories that you have listed, it would be really interesting to explore if there is a healing outcome in that game.
That's a good question. I would imagine that would be like the goal would be healing on some level. Um, I think more of an understanding now that we know the truth. Like if you play the truth game, you learn some of Canadian history. From an Indigenous perspective, it's a history of violence. And the reconciliation game is going to be toward what we can do, or it's about what we can do in order to help ameliorate some of those circumstances that were created or that exist now. So yeah, in that regard, it would be about healing some historical wounds. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a social worker or psychologist or doctor or medical professional in any way. But one of the categories. So there in this new game, there are going to be it's going to be a series of cards that actually. Do you want to see the game board?
Yes.
I just finished the artwork. So I've been working on the reconciliation game for probably about a month. I met with the publisher of the Truth game, and we're discussing what we can do about the reconciliation game. This is the game board here.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
There are 6 feathers. These are eagle feathers, and each of them contains. There are these ubiquitous teachings that you might see or might have heard of the grandfather teachings or the sacred teachings: love, honesty, truth, humility, courage, wisdom, and respect. So those are the 7 so-called sacred teachings. And in the Anishinaabe philosophy, 6 of them live in your heart, and one of them, wisdom, lives in your head. And so in this game, the idea is that you're going to collect these teachings and then finally make it to wisdom, which is in the center here. And then that will be the basis of reconciliation by earning and learning all of these other teachings. So that's what I've got so far. And again, I'm hoping that it does result in some gives people some direction anyway, because we don't. You're going to ask 7 different people or 10 different people what reconciliation means. You're going to get 10 different answers, right? And all of them would be correct, I would imagine. But there's no unified response when it comes to what reconciliation looks like, because it's such a huge issue, and nobody really wants to tackle that. So I'm hoping that with this game, it'll be grounded in some of those old teachings.
Well, the reconciliation piece is so important because just even from a commission perspective, there were recommendations made, there were apologies made, and so the intention is to make some real systemic changes so that things won't occur again that have occurred in the past. And so the reconciliation piece is so important to avoid this from happening ever again. So I think that what you're doing with the creation of this game is so paramount because for the average Canadian and person who wants to learn more about truth and reconciliation, but also do something that will improve the lives of everyone in this country, including Indigenous people. I think it's so important.
Yes, yeah, it's not going to hurt anybody anyway. This concept of reconciliation, it's not going to hurt, right? You're not going to lose anything. You have everything to gain, because now one of the popular misconceptions is that Indigenous people don't really contribute to the Canadian society, or that we're a drag on Canadian society somehow. Um, However, if you go through the process of reconciliation and restore us to where we once were, that completely changes that dynamic. A lot of people have to remember that much of what we now consider as Canadian society wouldn't exist if it weren't for the contributions of our Indigenous ancestors who helped the settlers when they first arrived and coping with this, the realities that were in this new land.
I just wanted to share with our listeners what you showed me. So, James showed me a rendering of the game board for his upcoming game related to reconciliation, and it relates to the seven sacred teachings. And there are six feathers on this game board, and each feather represents one of those sacred teachings. And in the background is a circle, and that circle represents wisdom, which is the seventh sacred teaching. And it's just really brilliantly and vibrantly painted with such incredible color. And so that is what I was seeing when you showed me that. So I just wanted to sort of share that with you just to give you an idea of what that game board looks like. I mentioned off the top that you're Anishinaabe of the Ojibwe Nation. You mentioned that you are a part of the Bear Clan. Your Ojibwe name is Wab Macoons, which means little white bear. What is your hope for the outcome of truth and reconciliation?
Equality, very simply. Right now, as far as I know, we are, if not the only people, then one of the few people in the world. Indigenous people in Canada are one of the few, if not the only people in the world who have an act that specifically defines or identifies who we are. And it's called the Indian Act. And if I'm treated a certain way by the government and then, therefore by the rest of society because of the provisions that are contained within this piece of legislation. And typically it is not to our benefit. I'll put it that way. We don't benefit from the Indian Act necessarily. It was more, I think it was more of a way when it was first brought about as a way for the Crown to work with Indigenous people, like a policy statement or a policy document, which evolved into the Indian Act. And a lot of those policies are outdated. They're based in old ways of thinking, and they're no longer applicable. They're no longer applicable with our understanding today of human rights and how things haven't gone well for Indigenous people. A lot of it stems from the provisions of the Indian Act. And if it weren't for the Indian Act, I think that we would be on an equal status as, or an equal footing as any other Canadian. That Indian Act is what sets us apart, and it creates a lower class of citizen, if you want to call it that, within Canada. In my study or my understanding of Canadian history, Indigenous people were innovative, competitive, intelligent, hardworking, successful to the point that legislation like the Indian Act had to be enacted in order to handcuff us or keep us down, because the settlers couldn't compete with the efficacy, the hardworking Indigenous people who were here, who were on the land for thousands and thousands of years. That we knew the ways of the land, and non-Indigenous people couldn't keep up. And so they petitioned their governments, their respective governments, who were in control at the time, to find some ways to suppress our activity. And so things like the Indian Act would come into being. And that was only intended to slow us down. I'll give you an example. don't remember the name of the act or the law, but the colonial government back in 1856 in Ontario, the what it would be Upper Canada, government of Upper Canada in Northern Ontario, the lumber companies were complaining that they could not compete with Indigenous equivalents. So my ancestors, the Aanishinaabe, outperformed, outworked, outproduced, did much better, and were more successful than the white companies that were operating in the area. And because of this, they complained to the colonial government, "Hey, we can't compete. We need to do something. What can we do to make our profits better?" And so what they did was they passed a law saying it was illegal for any white person to trade with an Indigenous company. And because the law was passed, that obviously devastated the Indigenous economy in that logging sector. There's always been, that systemic bias built into the systems that we have. So when I talk about equality, if all of those things were removed and we were just left alone to do our own thing, there'd be no complaints. The complaint would be going back to those complaints that led to the creation of that exclusive law back in 1856. They would be saying, what can we do to decrease the efficiency and the work ethic of Indigenous people, because we can't compete with them. That's what I'd like to see. That's what I'd like to see. Just removal of all of those barriers, all of the legislation, all of the policy that keep us down and have kept us down, and we can do our own thing, and then nobody has to worry about us. Nobody will have any complaints except that we're doing too much, and we're taking over what they used to do because we're better at it. That's what I'd like to see ultimately.
What does resilience mean to you?
Resilience. Good question. I think of maybe a blade of grass. A blade of grass. You can be stepped on, you can be burned, cut, cut down, but you still keep growing. You still keep coming back. That's what I think resilience is. In spite of all of these things that have happened, we keep coming back.
This season, I'm exploring the connection between compassion and resilience and how compassion influences resilience. So I'm wondering whether you have an ideas around that interplay between compassion and resilience.
Compassion is one of those teachings. Compassion and kindness. Actually, that is one of the in this new game, the reconciliation game. Instead of shame and humility cards, you're going to have compassion and kindness cards. My understanding of compassion is that you are able to put yourself into a situation, not where you experience, maybe you have a vicarious experience and you feel for the person who is suffering, right? Who's experiencing those feelings. And we often associate that with negative feelings. I mean, you can be compassionate with joyous feelings too, I would imagine. But as it relates to resilience, if you can put yourself into a situation where you understand what that person is experiencing or going through, you're less likely to stand in their way, or you're more likely to offer assistance in helping them through their troubling time. You know how people will come together when there's a family member dies, or there's a death in the family. There's a lot of compassion, right? A lot of people, because we've all experienced it, will go over and we'll help that person, and we'll do what we can to offer them assistance. I guess you could say the same. You see the same kind of compassion when maybe they've had their first child. They'll come over and they'll offer advice and help and things like that. So compassion can go both ways in that regard. But in regard to resilience, yes, if I see someone suffering, I kind of understand what they might be going through, because I've also experienced that suffering. Again, even if it's not going out of my way to help that person, then at least maybe if I was one of those kinds of people who would blame them and just say, "Oh, why don't they just get a job or whatever?" I'll say, "No, no, I can understand why. Having been there, I can understand why they're maybe not able to work, right? Because they've got all this crazy stuff going on in their head. I've been there. I know that, and so you show a little bit of compassion that way. So instead of actively resisting or opposing, you're standing back and you're not doing anything at all, which is probably better than the actively opposing. Whereas others, in terms of compassion and resilience, they might go and be actively involved in helping that person with their troubles and their difficulties.
How can people reach you if they want to contact you?
The best way would be through the website, easternwoodlandart.ca or .com, either one of them.
Aanishinaabe of the Ojibwe Nation, James Darin Corbiere is the artist behind Eastern Woodland Art and creator of the in Truth and Reconciliation, the board game. James Miigwech, thank you so much for sharing your story, your powerful story, and for sharing your insights on how we can live in a better society. Thank you for sharing your art. Thank you for sharing your heart. And I just appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your time. I enjoyed spending time with you.
Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Blue Sky at thestumblingspirit.bsky.social. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.